Again, this is Jerry with another Photoshop tutorial for you. So today I'm going to show you how to separate a subject from the background, and unlike in a prior tutorial where I showed you how to eliminate the background and make it a solid white or to substitute a color, here we're going to add an actual photo scene and composite her onto that. I'm going to do this quick and dirty for you. If you're doing it for real, you should take a little bit more time. But in the interest of showing you the technique, let's kind of zoom through this. The first thing I always do when I'm working with a subject in Photoshop is make sure I'm working on a new layer as much as possible. That way, at any point during the process, if you realize you made your mistake, you can get rid of that layer and you don't lose the underlying image. You haven't done anything totally destructive to your image. So the first thing we're going to do is duplicate our background. Now, one way to do it is to grab it and drag that layer down to the new layer icon. That creates a second layer. You can also use Command or Control J, which does the same thing. So here we have my model Ashley on a gray background in my studio, and what we want to do is take her off of the background. There's a great tool that's been added to the newest versions of Photoshop. I'm in Photoshop 2020, and that's the Object Select tool. So I'm going to grab that off of my toolbar. Now, if you don't have that, take a look at your help menus for Photoshop, and depending on the version you've got, you can go in and actually edit this toolbar to show or hide items that you might not use all the time. So I added this to mine because I had a customized toolbar. If you're using it right out of the box, you've probably got all the tools showing. You may have two columns showing here. But the point is, we're going to get to the object selection tool. When you do that, at the top, you've got a sub-menu. One of them is the method by which you're going to select the object. I'm going to keep it on lasso because I already know from running through this image before the tutorial that I'm going to have a couple of areas where I need to make some freehand moves. So now here, just draw around your subject, and Photoshop will close that. It by default will figure that everything inside that lasso area is where it's going to look to find your object. So if you have a scene with multiple objects, maybe she was standing next to a child or she was standing next to a piece of furniture and I didn't want that furniture selected, by using the lasso and just defining the area around her body, Photoshop did a very fast and effective job of grabbing her. Now there's a couple of things we need to refine on this image. If you look down here, you'll see that the zippers on the boots are not selected, but that's an easy one to fix later. There are, however, a couple of spots in here. You can see under her arm that it's missing some detail. Or I should say it's including some of the gray background through the space between her jacket and her arm. And then in particular, what I really care about is this space between her hand and her head where the gray is showing through. And if I left this selection, it would be very difficult comparatively to clean that up and still preserve the detail of the hair later. So what I want to do is exclude this area from my selection. Well, how do you do that? If you hold the Option key down, then that cursor changes to a minus sign. If you hold the Shift key down, then it changes to a plus sign. So if for some reason I said, oh, I want some of this space outside of her arm, I'd hold the Shift key and say, I'm sorry, you missed something. And then Photoshop's going to go and add that area. Well, I don't want to do that here. What I want to do is exclude, not add. So I'm going to hold the Option key down, and I'm going to come right around this space. Don't have to be precise, but try to keep it more or less where you want this to be selected. And you can see it deselected this section of hair and that gray background. Now, it also missed a little bit of her jacket. I could fix that later, but if I hold the Shift key down and I draw in there, then you can see that Photoshop said, oh, sorry, you wanted that, and it gave it back to me. So that's fine. That looks good. Have to do the same thing on the other side, so I'm going to hold the Option key down. I'm going to grab outside of this area of the hair. I'm going to come up here because I prefer that as much of that hair as possible is excluded, and you can see that now it has excluded quite a bit of that hair. So I'm happy with that. Actually, there's a little bit of the gray right here. I might as well fix that. I'm going to hold the Option key again and draw around this spot and say, hey, I don't want that. And you can see it came back down to the edge of her jacket. Well, a troublesome area that you often find are these little spots, and it could be between arms or spaces between the arm and the body. And you could go in there with a pen tool and select along the entire edge and then delete it later. But let's just try to do it now. I'm going to hold the Option key down. I'm going to draw around this area. And depending on how friendly Photoshop is feeling today, it did a pretty good job on most of this. I'm going to go back in and select a little bit more because it missed some of this. It doesn't like some of this. These are always troublesome areas. Okay, there it can't find enough contrast. Oops, let me go back where I was. Part of the problem is I've deselected some of my jacket, so I'm going to come back in and grab that jacket and say I want that included. And you can see it says it can't find enough contrast to do that space. You can try this a couple more times. You may or may not have any luck in doing it. I'm going to try this one more time. I'm going to hold the add and say I want to add that. Sorry, no, it can't find a line of contrast, and that's because there's a lot of blur. There's pixelation because we're really at a fine level of detail. So I'm going to try one last time to take this bottom section out. Sorry. Nope, it can't find contrast. So we're going to leave that. But we did get rid of about 75% of it, so let's see how the next step works. I think it's going to work pretty good for us. Once you've made your initial selection, you need to go to the other submenu button up here at the top, select and mask. What that's going to do is take your selection and create a mask of it. Now, I talked about this in a prior episode. There's different ways you can show the mask. You can do black on white, but the problem with that is you don't know sometimes where the edges are. I prefer the overlay because it allows me to see some of the detail through. Now I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to come down here and just paint over these areas that didn't get picked up, these zippers, and you can see it did a pretty good job of including that now. There was a little bit of a space right here at the crotch I'd noticed. I cleaned that up, and now I can go under this arm and just come along that edge, and you should see, yep, now we've got a separation between the jacket and the arm, which is what we were trying to get anyway. So with respect to the areas of hair, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to paint mostly just in the edges here where the hair was. You can see that selected that. Go around the outside of the hair because otherwise it looks like a helmet head and not natural hair. You want to be able to pick up some of the wispies, which it's done. And now that last little area that we had where we excluded this hair at the bottom, no problem. We're going to bring it back in by painting over that. So now we have a pretty good selection of her. I'd say that works. There's a couple little things about it that I probably would be happier with if I spent a little bit more time. Here's a tiny bit of the leg. All right, so now we have to output this to our image. Because I created a second layer, a duplicate layer, I don't have to save this to a new layer. I can just save it as a selection, hit OK. I come back to my image, and here we have the full selection. Now what we need to do to make a composite is we need to save this. So go under the Select menu at the top, come down to Save Selection, and then it's going to ask you to name your selection. Scott Detweiler, great teacher and friend, uses the naming convention of 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to call this number 1. All right, now that I've got it saved, I can deselect it by hitting Command or Control D, and now I've got the image back, but I don't have to go and select it again. I've saved that selection. So if I go down to Load Selection, and look for channel 1, voila, there we go. We're right back to the selection we had before. I already see a couple little things that I would have cleaned up, but just make sure you go slow and that you've got everything you want selected before you go on to these next steps. So now I've got her in this picture, and instead of changing the color, I want to add a photo. Go to the File menu, down to Place Embedded. I've got a number of images here that I had purchased a few years ago. I need something that's vertical because she's a vertical image. And so here's one that looks pretty good to me. And we've got a street scene. Well, the problem with this street scene is that you know that she takes up about 75% of this canvas. That's going to look pretty strange if she's superimposed on that building. She's going to look like the Jolly Green Giant. So what we need to do here is change. Now I can just stretch this image before I save it down, and that might be close, but I still think her head's going to be up in here someplace. So what I want to do is I want to expand my canvas. Oops, I need to save this by double clicking on it. That'll save my resizing of this layer. But you see there's a lot cut off from the original picture, so I want to get some of that back so I've got room to work on it. I'm going to go down and change the canvas size. I like where the bottom is with respect to her feet. I want her in the front of this scene. I don't want her back here in the back. So I'm going to make my changes relative to the front, or the leading edge of my image. And I'm going to add, I think, see, this is in inches. I think I can add 10 inches wide and let's say 15 inches high from that point. So it's going to expand the canvas, and as you can see, my canvas is bigger. It's filled with white, but if I go back and grab this image now and fill that canvas, I think we're going to see that we're in pretty good shape. Okay, so that's filled it. I'm going to save that by double clicking on it, and now when I go and load that selection, bring my subject back into the foreground, I think she's going to fit this a whole lot better. Still a little bit big, but you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm going to deselect for a second. I don't need to make the canvas bigger. I just need to make the part of it that she's in a little bit bigger so that she doesn't seem outrageously tall in this image. So we'll save it down again. Now I'm going to load selection one more time. You get the idea of what I'm trying to do here. And now it's okay. She's in the foreground. Depending on your perspective, that may still be a little bit tall, but we're looking pretty good. I'm going to do it just to do it one more time. Stretch this out just a little bit more because I kind of like the idea that her head ends up under that marquee. And I'm going to stop that. Okay. Probably would have made it a little bit wider and included all that street light, but I'm just trying to give you the technique. One thing we need to do, however, she's going to be standing in this foreground, and the building in this image is still pretty well in focus, and in real life that wouldn't be the case. You wouldn't have a subject in the same focal plane up here as a building that might be 10 or 15 feet behind them. So before I bring her back, I'm going to go to the filter menu. I'm going to go to blur, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to pick a blur here. I've got 12, 13, something like that, 10 or 12, probably about 10. That's good enough. And I'm going to apply a Gaussian blur. What that's going to do is put a slight blur on everything in the picture. You can see the sharp, contrasty parts of that graffiti on the wall now are a little blurred out. She's going to look a lot more natural when we bring her in. So one last time, We're almost done with this. We're going to go to load selection. We're going to bring back channel 1, which is her. Now she's looking better relative to the scene. The last step to bring her in is we need to, this is a selection only, need to hold the option key and click mask. And when you do that, then she comes back into the scene. And it doesn't look bad. She's in focus. The wall behind her is slightly out of focus. All right, one last thing we need to do here, and then we'll be done for today, is that when you put a subject onto a background, you see how she looks like she's pasted in? Well, that's a problem. We don't want that to be the case. How do we get away from that? Well, what we do is up here on our top layer, click on the image, not on the mask. Okay, we don't want to select her, but we want the underlying image. Remember, this mask is laying on top, basically, of the background image. And then, now I know this is a smart object because I've done this before. I'm going to double click on it. Oh, maybe it's going to be okay. All right, let me see. If I click on the brush tool, nope. It wants to rasterize this. It's a smart object. If you don't know about smart objects, there's lots of tutorials online. I don't need to take you back through it again, but I need to rasterize this image. I'm going to select the brush tool, black color, and I'm going to put my flow down pretty low up here. I'm going to select a soft brush and a size relative to her. That looks pretty good right here. And on the image layer, remember the image layer is under her, so when I paint here, I'm making shadows. I don't want a shadow behind her, I want the shadow in front of her. Let me see, let me go back. I'm trying to do this without a Wacom pad here, so I don't have quite the same control. There we go. Now, from on her foot, in the direction of this light source behind her, I've got a little bit of a shadow running this way. Well, the body might be, a little bit bigger here, so we're going to start filling out the body, and you see that I've added a little bit of, by using a low flow, I'm not actually painting in black, I'm painting in a little bit of gray. So here we've got an image that looks pretty good. I'd probably add an overlay to this. There's different ways of doing that. I happen to have a tool set that I purchased. Pratik Naik is involved in this. If you don't know Pratik's name, you've got to look him up online. Great retoucher. But there's an infinite texture panel and an infinite color panel. They're not cheap, but he sells these, and it's a great tool. I already went in and selected. You can find different objects, traces of light, searchlights. There's not just lights. There's other elements. Hell, I could put an animal in here. I could put an eagle in the middle of that picture, but that doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to go back to the light. I like the flare. There's some sun flare. I think I like this. If you click in here, it'll change. But I'm going to pick this one just to show you what I would do. The advantage of an overlay is it helps homogenize the colors between your background image and whatever you shot. So I'm going to close this because it's good enough. Now this image came in right on top of the other one, and it comes in automatically in screen mode, meaning that you see the light areas but you don't see the dark. That's why it looks good. But it's on the wrong side. There wouldn't be a flare here. The light is up in the right corner. So I'm going to use Command T to select this. I'm going to make it bigger, and then I'm going to rotate it so that I get it up in the same area where those lights would be. If you're following me along, you can see some of that flares coming down here, And that really looks pretty good. Well, it's too bright. That's okay. You can decrease the opacity a little bit. And now you get a little bit of light leak coming out from the lights, coming down onto her. A couple of little orbs in the image. And altogether it looks pretty good. Again, I'd play with that a little bit more. I'd probably mask off part of it. But we're pretty much done. So here we go. We've pulled her out. We brought her into this image. Might adjust the curves a little bit as well on this. Add a curve panel. And bring up the light on this scene just a tiny bit. Or be moody and take it down a little bit. But, you know, I want to balance my foreground and my background. That looks pretty good. And there we go. You've got a pretty acceptable image from where we started, right? All right, well, if you enjoyed this, click the like button. I'd love it if you would subscribe to the channel as well, and then you'll get my future content. Thank you very much.